February 14th, 1945. The wind screamed across the barren fields of southern Germany like a chorus of mourning widows. Snow fell in thick, relentless curtains, blanketing the skeletal remains of what had once been a prosperous farming village near the town of Heilbronn. The temperature had plummeted to 18 degrees below zero. In the gray pre-dawn hours, a convoy of American trucks growled through the frozen landscape, their exhaust clouds hanging like ghosts in the bitter air. Inside the canvas-covered beds, huddled beneath wool blankets that did little to ward off the cold, sat 73 women. Their faces were drawn, pale as winter itself. Their lips had turned the color of bruised plums. These were not civilians fleeing the approaching front. These were prisoners of war. German women who had served the Third Reich in roles that placed them squarely within the machinery of warfare. Communications officers, anti-aircraft auxiliaries, intelligence analysts, medical personnel attached to SS units. They wore the remnants of their uniforms beneath layers of whatever clothing they had managed to salvage. Some still had their military-issue boots. Others wrapped their feet in rags. They did not speak. They did not weep. They simply stared ahead with the hollow-eyed resignation of those who had already accepted their fate. The trucks passed through checkpoints marked by American flags snapping violently in the wind. GIs in heavy winter gear stamped their feet and blew into their gloved hands, their breath forming small clouds that vanished almost instantly. The convoy turned off the main road onto a narrow path that led toward a cluster of military tents and hastily constructed wooden barracks surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire. This was prisoner of war processing Camp 27B. Established barely 3 weeks earlier to handle the sudden influx of enemy combatants as Allied forces pressed deeper into German territory. The camp was designed to hold 200 prisoners. It currently housed 412, and now 73 more were arriving. As the trucks rolled to a halt inside the compound, American soldiers emerged from the warmth of nearby structures. Steam rose from the vents of field kitchens. The smell of coffee and frying bacon drifted across the frozen ground, an aroma so foreign, so impossibly rich in that landscape of deprivation, that several of the women closed their eyes as if the scent alone might sustain them. The tailgates dropped with metallic clangs. A sergeant, his face weathered and serious, called out in accented German for the prisoners to disembark. They moved slowly, stiffly, their bodies cramped from hours of travel in the unheated trucks. Several stumbled as their feet touched the icy ground. One woman, no more than 22 years old with blonde hair matted against her skull, collapsed entirely. 2 GIs rushed forward without hesitation, lifting her gently between them and carrying her toward the camp infirmary. The remaining women were lined up in formation, just as they had been trained to do in their own military service. They stood at attention despite their exhaustion, despite the cold that penetrated through every layer of clothing and settled deep in their bones. They expected what prisoners of war had expected for centuries. They expected to be stripped of their remaining possessions. They expected interrogation. They expected insufficient food, overcrowded barracks, disease, perhaps violence. They had heard the stories, whispered accounts from soldiers returning from the Eastern Front about what Soviet forces did to captured German women. They had heard rumors about French resistance fighters exacting vengeance on female collaborators. They did not know what Americans would do, but they had been taught by years of Nazi propaganda to expect the worst. They had been told that American soldiers were criminals released from prisons to fight, that they were degenerates motivated only by base desires, that the United States was a mongrel nation without culture or honor. Now they would discover the truth. A captain stepped forward. His name was Robert Hastings, a 34-year-old former high school history teacher from Pennsylvania who had volunteered for service in 1942. He had seen combat at Normandy, had walked through the devastation of French villages, had witnessed horrors that would never leave his memory. But he had also been raised by parents who believed in certain immutable principles: human dignity, the rule of law, the idea that even in war, there were lines that should not be crossed. He looked at the women before him, and he saw not enemies, not representatives of a regime he despised, but human beings in desperate need. He raised his voice so all could hear, and in careful, measured German, he spoke. "You are prisoners of war under the protection of the United States Army. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will receive food, shelter, and medical care. You will not be harmed. You will not be insulted. You will be treated with the respect due to any prisoner of war." The words hung in the frozen air. Several of the women exchanged glances of confusion. This was not what they expected. This was not what they had been told to expect. But they remained silent, standing rigidly in formation, waiting for the moment when the mask would slip, when the true nature of their captivity would reveal itself. To understand the shock that would soon transform these women's understanding of their enemy, one must first comprehend the world from which they came. By February 1945, Germany was a nation consuming itself. The Third Reich, which Hitler had proclaimed would last 1,000 years, was collapsing after barely 12. The Eastern Front had become a charnel house, where entire armies disappeared into the vast Soviet expanse. The Western Front pressed inexorably toward the Rhine. German cities were being reduced to rubble by relentless Allied bombing campaigns. Dresden had burned. Hamburg had burned. Berlin was burning. The civilian population faced starvation as supply lines collapsed and agricultural production plummeted. Ration cards guaranteed little. Black markets flourished. People burned furniture to stay warm. They ate potato peels and boiled grass. Children who had never known peace grew thin and hollow-eyed. The women now standing in that American POW camp had lived through this gradual disintegration. Many had joined auxiliary military services not out of fanatical devotion to Nazi ideology, but out of economic necessity, patriotic duty, or simply because the state demanded it. The Wehrmacht and SS had increasingly relied on female personnel as manpower shortages became critical. Women served as Luftwaffe auxiliaries, operating searchlights and anti-aircraft batteries. They worked as signal corps operators, maintaining communications networks. They served in administrative roles that freed men for combat duty. Some, like the Nachrichtenhelferin, communications helpers, had been stationed in frontline areas, exposed to the same dangers as male soldiers. They had experienced aerial bombardment, artillery fire, and the terror of rapid retreat before advancing enemy forces. These women had been taught that their service was essential to Germany's survival, that they were protecting the fatherland from annihilation by hostile foreign powers bent on Germany's complete destruction. Propaganda had painted the Allied forces, particularly the Soviets and Americans, as existential threats not just to the German state, but to German civilization itself. The narrative was consistent and pervasive. Defeat meant not just military loss, but the end of German culture, the enslavement of the German people, the violation of German women. Every newsreel, every radio broadcast, every poster reinforced this message. Surrender was not merely military capitulation. It was betrayal. It was the acceptance of a fate worse than death. When these women were captured, some in the confusion of rapid American advances, others when their units were surrounded and overwhelmed, a few who had simply found themselves unable to retreat further, they carried with them the accumulated weight of this propaganda. They expected to be treated as their own propaganda claimed Allied forces treated prisoners. They expected the barbarism they had been told was characteristic of their enemies. And in those first hours of captivity, as they stood shivering in that frozen compound, they braced themselves for confirmation of everything they had been taught to believe. What happened, instead, would shatter their preconceptions so completely that many would struggle for years afterward to reconcile what they experienced with what they had been told. The first shock came within 30 minutes of their arrival. After Captain Hastings' brief speech, the women were escorted not to crowded barracks or exposed holding pens, but to a large heated tent that served as a processing center. Inside, portable stoves roared, generating waves of warmth that hit the frozen prisoners like a physical force. Several gasped audibly. They had not felt genuine warmth in weeks, perhaps months. German civilians were burning furniture and books to create a few hours of heat in bombed-out buildings. Here, the Americans heated a tent for prisoners. Medical personnel, including 2 female army nurses, moved among the new arrivals, conducting rapid health assessments. They checked for frostbite, signs of disease, malnutrition, injuries. The blonde woman who had collapsed was already in the infirmary receiving treatment for severe hypothermia and pneumonia. Those with obvious medical needs were immediately separated for care. The others were given forms to complete: name, rank, unit, date of capture. The questions were administrative, not accusatory. No one demanded ideological declarations. No one forced them to denounce Hitler or the Nazi regime. No one struck them or threatened them. The American soldiers were professional, efficient, and notably absent of hostility. Then came the second shock, the one that would be remembered and recounted for decades. The women were led to another tent where long tables had been set up cafeteria style. Steam rose from serving trays. The smell that had teased them upon arrival now became overwhelming. White bread, real butter, coffee. Not the roasted grain substitute that Germans had been drinking for years, but actual coffee with a rich, deep aroma. Scrambled eggs, bacon, canned fruit, milk. The portions were not meager rations measured by the ounce. They were American military portions, the same food that American soldiers ate, served on metal trays by GIs who performed this duty with the same casual efficiency they brought to every task. For a moment, no one moved. The women stood before this abundance as if confronting an elaborate hallucination. One woman, a former Luftwaffe auxiliary named Greta Hoffmann, who would later record her experiences in a memoir published in 1972, described the scene. "We thought it was a trick. We thought they would let us see the food and then take it away, to humiliate us, to break our spirits. We had seen such cruelty on the Eastern Front. Why would our enemies be any different?" But the American soldier behind the table simply gestured for us to move forward. When I didn't move, he said in broken German, "Eat, you must be hungry." His voice held no mockery, no hatred, just simple human acknowledgement of an obvious fact. They ate. Most did so slowly at first, still uncertain, still waiting for the punishment they believed must be coming. But hunger is a powerful force, and they had been hungry for so long. The food was real. The portions were substantial. And when they finished, they were offered more. Several women wept as they ate, tears streaming down their faces as they consumed scrambled eggs and buttered bread. Others ate in stunned silence, mechanically lifting forks to their mouths, as if their bodies were operating independently of their minds. A few could not eat at all. Their stomachs had shrunk too much, their systems were too shocked by the sudden abundance. These women were given lighter fare: broth, crackers, small portions that their bodies could handle. As the women ate, American soldiers moved about the tent performing their duties, refilling coffee urns, bringing additional supplies from the kitchen tent. Some of the GIs were young, barely out of their teenage years, farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit who had been transformed into soldiers by the machinery of war. Others were older, seasoned combat veterans who had seen friends die in the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes. They looked at these German prisoners and saw perhaps their own sisters, their own wives and girlfriends back home. Or perhaps they simply saw what Captain Hastings saw: human beings in need. One GI, a corporal named James Mitchell from Oklahoma, would write in a letter to his wife dated February 18, 1945. "We got a group of German women prisoners yesterday. They looked like they hadn't eaten in weeks. Skin and bones, most of them. We fed them the same stuff we eat. You should have seen their faces, honey. Like they couldn't believe it was real. Made me think of you and Sarah, and what I'd hoped someone would do for you if things were reversed. I know they're the enemy. I know what their country has done. But looking at those women, half-starved and frozen, I couldn't see enemies. I just saw people who needed help. Maybe that makes me soft, but I don't care. That's why we're better than them." This sentiment, expressed privately by a soldier in a letter home, captured something essential about the American approach to prisoners of war, something that would prove more devastating to Nazi ideology than any bombing campaign or military defeat. The United States, for all its flaws and contradictions, operated under a fundamentally different premise about human value than the Third Reich. American soldiers had been raised in a culture that, despite its failures to fully live up to its ideals, nevertheless held those ideals as aspirational truths. All men are created equal, endowed with certain unalienable rights. Among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These were not mere words. They were principles embedded in American institutions, taught in American schools, preached in American churches, debated in American town halls. When American soldiers treated prisoners with basic human decency, they were not acting against their cultural training. They were acting in accordance with it. The contrast with Nazi ideology could not have been more stark. The Third Reich operated on principles of racial hierarchy, social Darwinism, and the glorification of strength over mercy. Compassion was weakness. Humanitarian concern was sentimentality. The state existed to serve the race, and individuals had value only insofar as they served the state's interests. Prisoners of war were at best sources of labor to be exploited, at worst obstacles to be eliminated. Soviet prisoners in German camps died by the millions, worked to death, starved, executed. When Germans encountered prisoners who treated them according to the Geneva Convention, they were encountering not just different policies, but a fundamentally different worldview. After the meal, the women were assigned to barracks. These were not luxurious accommodations by any standard. They were simple wooden structures with rows of bunk beds, communal latrines, and minimal privacy. But they were heated. Each prisoner received blankets, multiple blankets, thick wool blankets that provided actual warmth. They received clean clothing to replace their filthy, lice-infested garments. They were permitted to shower with hot water, a luxury so extreme that several women stood under the streams of warm water until the MPs supervising the facility had to urge them to finish so others could have their turn. They received basic toiletries, soap, toothpaste, brushes. They were given sanitary supplies. These were standard provisions, the minimum required by the Geneva Convention, nothing more than what international law demanded. But to women who came from a country where such supplies had become almost impossible to obtain, where the basic infrastructure of civilized life was collapsing, this minimum felt like extravagance. Greta Hoffmann, the former Luftwaffe auxiliary, wrote in her memoir, "That first night in the American camp, I lay in my bunk beneath warm blankets, my stomach full for the first time in months, and I felt a confusion so profound it was almost painful. Everything we had been told was a lie. The Americans were not savages. They were not degenerates. They had rules, and they followed them. They had abundance, and they shared it. I thought of my brother, who had died at Stalingrad. I thought of my father, who had been killed in an Allied bombing raid on Stuttgart. I thought of all the propaganda, all the speeches, all the promises that Germany was fighting for civilization against barbarism. And I realized that we had been the barbarians all along, not through any innate evil in the German people, but because we had allowed ourselves to be led by men who convinced us that cruelty was strength and compassion was weakness. That night I cried for the first time since my capture, not from fear or despair, but from shame. Not all the women experienced such immediate ideological transformation. Some remained committed Nazis, convinced that the decent treatment was temporary, a psychological trick designed to make them compliant. Others were simply too traumatized, too exhausted, too focused on survival to engage in political reflection. But even among the true believers, seeds of doubt had been planted. They could rationalize propaganda. They could rationalize military defeats. What they could not rationalize was the gap between what they had been told about their enemies and what they directly experienced. The days that followed established a routine that further reinforced these revelations. The prisoners woke to breakfast: oatmeal, eggs, bread, coffee. They were assigned work details, as was permitted under the Geneva Convention: cleaning the camp, assisting in the kitchens, laundry duty, administrative tasks. The work was not excessive, and prisoners who were ill or injured were excused from labor entirely. They received 3 meals a day, every day, without exception. The quality and quantity of food remained consistent. This was perhaps the most psychologically disorienting aspect of their captivity. The predictability, the stability, the absence of arbitrary cruelty. One of the prisoners, Margaret Schultz, had served as a radio operator with a Panzer division. She had been captured near Colmar when her unit was overrun during the Allied offensive in Alsace. Before the war, she had been a schoolteacher in Munich, raised in a moderately religious Catholic household that had been ambivalent about the Nazi Party, but had nevertheless accommodated itself to the regime out of a mixture of patriotism, fear, and social pressure. In the camp, she found herself assigned to kitchen duty, working alongside American soldiers to prepare meals for the prisoners. She later recounted her experience in an oral history recorded in 1989. "I worked next to an American Negro soldier. I had never been this close to a Negro before. We had been taught that they were inferior, subhuman even. But this man, his name was Robert, he treated me with courtesy. He showed me how to operate the large cooking equipment. He shared his cigarettes with me during breaks. He showed me photographs of his wife and children back in Georgia. He spoke about his hopes to open a restaurant after the war. He was intelligent, articulate, kind. Everything I had been taught about racial inferiority, it crumbled in the face of this man's simple humanity. If they had lied to us about this, what else had they lied about? The question haunted many of the prisoners. What else had been lies? The stories about Jewish atrocities? The claims that Germany had been forced into war? The promises that final victory was inevitable? The propaganda about American degeneracy? Each day in the camp provided new evidence that contradicted years of indoctrination. The American camp commander, Colonel William Sanders, insisted on strict adherence to the Geneva Convention, not out of softness, but out of principle. He posted copies of the convention in German on the barracks walls. He established a prisoner committee that could bring complaints directly to American authorities. He allowed the prisoners to hold religious services, both Protestant and Catholic, with chaplains provided by the U.S. Army. He permitted them to write letters home, subject to censorship for military information, but otherwise unrestricted. He arranged for Red Cross parcels to be distributed, and he ensured that the prisoners received them. This last point, the Red Cross parcels, became another symbol of the vast gulf between American abundance and German deprivation. These packages, standardized boxes containing chocolate, cigarettes, canned meat, coffee, soap, and other supplies, were distributed to prisoners of war throughout American custody. To the German women, these parcels represented wealth almost beyond comprehension. Chocolate had disappeared from Germany years earlier, existing only as a memory for most civilians. Real coffee was a luxury that even high-ranking party officials struggled to obtain. And yet here, prisoners of war received these items as a matter of routine. The packages bore the symbols of the International Red Cross, but they were filled with American goods, products of American industrial capacity and agricultural abundance. Each parcel was a small demonstration of the enormous disparity between American resources and German scarcity. One woman, Anna Brandt, who had worked as a decoder with Army Group B headquarters, kept a diary throughout her captivity, writing on scraps of paper that she carefully preserved. Her entry from February 28, 1945, reads, "Received another Red Cross parcel today. Chocolate. Real chocolate. I saved a small piece and let it melt slowly on my tongue, trying to remember the last time I tasted such a thing. Must have been 1942, perhaps early 1943. Erica, the girl in the next bunk, gave hers away. She cannot eat such rich food anymore, her stomach rebels. She gave it to one of the guards, a young American boy who looks hardly old enough to shave. He was so surprised, so grateful. You would think she had given him gold. He tried to refuse, said prisoners should keep their rations. She insisted. He finally accepted and immediately broke the bar in half, gave half back to her, and shared the other half with two of his fellow soldiers. This casual generosity, this automatic sharing, I have never seen anything like it. When did we Germans become so hard, so grasping? When did we decide that kindness was weakness? The symbolic power of food in this context cannot be overstated. In human societies throughout history, the sharing of food has represented fundamental social bonds, the acknowledgement of common humanity, In a state of scarcity, food becomes a weapon, a tool of control, a marker of power. The Third Reich had weaponized hunger, using starvation as a deliberate policy against populations it deemed inferior or hostile. The Hunger Plan, designed to starve millions of Soviet citizens to create living space and resources for German colonization, was not an accidental outcome of war, but a deliberate strategy. German civilians, while not subjected to the same extreme measures, nevertheless experienced increasing deprivation as the war progressed and the Nazi state prioritized military needs over civilian welfare. American abundance, by contrast, was not merely propaganda but material reality. The United States had not experienced enemy bombing of its industrial base. Its agricultural regions remained intact and productive. Its factories operated at full capacity, producing not only weapons but also consumer goods, foodstuffs, and supplies. The American home front experienced rationing, certainly, but nothing comparable to the deprivation that German civilians endured. An American soldier received a daily ration that exceeded in caloric content and nutritional value what most German civilians could obtain even on the black market. And these soldiers, operating in a war zone thousands of miles from home, received hot meals prepared in field kitchens that operated with logistical efficiency that German forces could not match even in the best circumstances. When American soldiers shared this abundance with prisoners, they demonstrated more effectively than any propaganda campaign could have achieved the fundamental difference between the two systems. The Third Reich preached about German superiority, about the strength of the National Socialist system, about the decadence and weakness of democratic capitalism. But here, in a freezing prisoner of war camp in southern Germany, the prisoners could taste, smell, touch, and feel the concrete evidence that contradicted every propaganda claim. The weak, decadent democracy had fed them. The strong, superior National Socialist state had left them starving. As February turned to March and winter reluctantly yielded to early spring, the psychological transformation among many of the prisoners deepened. The camp established a small library with books in German, not political works but novels, poetry, history. Reading material had been scarce in Germany for years, with paper shortages and wartime publishing restrictions limiting what was available. Now prisoners had access to books that had been banned by the Nazi regime. Works by Jewish authors, by political dissidents, by writers whose ideas did not conform to National Socialist orthodoxy. Some women approached these texts with suspicion, conditioned by years of censorship to view forbidden books as dangerous. Others read voraciously, hungry for ideas and perspectives that had been denied to them. The camp also received newspapers, American military publications, and even some German-language papers published by the Allies. These papers contained news of the war's progress, presented from the Allied perspective. The prisoners learned about the ongoing military operations, the advance toward Berlin, the liberation of concentration camps. This last category of news produced varying reactions. Some dismissed it as Allied propaganda, refusing to believe accounts of industrial-scale genocide. Others experienced horrified recognition. They had heard rumors, whispered stories, fragmentary evidence of something terrible being done to Jews, Poles, Russians, and others deemed undesirable by the Nazi state. They had not known the full scope. Few Germans did, but they had known enough to harbor suspicions that they had suppressed out of fear, denial, or willful ignorance. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen in April 1945 produced particularly detailed reporting, including photographs that were posted on camp bulletin boards. American authorities made no attempt to hide the evidence from the prisoners. On the contrary, they insisted that prisoners see the photographs, read the accounts, confront the reality of what had been done in Germany's name. The images were horrific beyond description. Piles of emaciated corpses, survivors who appeared barely human, skeletal figures staring at cameras with eyes that had seen the depths of human cruelty. For many of the women prisoners, these images produced a crisis of conscience and belief. Greta Hoffmann described her reaction. "When I first saw the photographs from Bergen-Belsen, my immediate thought was that they must be fabrications, enemy propaganda designed to demoralize us. But the evidence was too extensive, too detailed. And then I remembered things I had tried not to notice. The transport trains that passed through our sector in 1943, freight cars packed with people, their hands reaching through barred windows, crying for water. We were told they were being resettled. We were told not to interfere. And we didn't ask questions because we were afraid. And because not asking questions was easier than confronting what the answers might be. Now I understood. Those people were being shipped to their deaths. And we, not all of us, but enough of us, had enabled it through our silence, our compliance, our willingness to believe comfortable lies rather than uncomfortable truths. Not all prisoners reached such conclusions. Some clung to denial, insisting that the photographs were sophisticated forgeries, that the evidence was manufactured by Allied propagandists. These women retreated into rigid ideology, protecting their worldview against contradictory evidence through psychological mechanisms that humans have always employed when faced with information that threatens fundamental beliefs. They formed small groups within the camp, supporting each other's denial, reinforcing each other's resistance to what they characterized as enemy brainwashing. But they were increasingly the minority. The majority of prisoners exposed daily to treatment that contradicted propaganda claims, confronted with evidence of atrocities committed by their own nation, and isolated from the reinforcing mechanisms of Nazi society, began the painful process of reassessing everything they had believed. The camp command recognized that this psychological transformation was occurring and, to some extent, encouraged it, not through coercion or aggressive re-education programs, but through simple exposure to different ideas and different values. Colonel Sanders, the camp commander, believed that democracy was best promoted not through propaganda, but through demonstration. He ensured that the camp operated fairly, that rules applied equally to all prisoners regardless of rank or background, that complaints were addressed through established procedures rather than arbitrary authority. He instituted a camp newspaper, written and edited by prisoners with oversight from American censors who removed military intelligence but allowed political and cultural content. The newspaper became a forum for debate among the prisoners, with some advocating continued resistance, and others arguing for acceptance of Germany's defeat and the need for national transformation. One particularly poignant aspect of camp life emerged in mid-March, when mail from home began to reach some of the prisoners. The German postal system was collapsing, but some letters still made it through, routed through neutral countries and international agencies. These letters brought news of the world outside the wire. Families living in cellars as cities were bombed around them, food shortages so severe that people were eating tulip bulbs and tree bark, the advancing Allied armies bringing both liberation and destruction, Soviet forces in the East committing atrocities that mirrored and exceeded what German forces had inflicted on Soviet territories. The letters painted a picture of a nation in its death throes, a society collapsing under the weight of its own hubris and the consequences of its crimes. One prisoner, Elizabeth Weber, received a letter from her mother in Cologne. The letter, written on brown paper with pencil that was barely legible, described how the city had been reduced to ruins, how Elizabeth's younger sister had been killed in a bombing raid, how her father had disappeared somewhere on the Eastern Front and was presumed dead, how her mother was living in the basement of a destroyed building with a dozen other refugees, how they ate once a day if they were lucky, how disease was spreading through the surviving population. The letter ended with a sentence that Elizabeth read over and over. "You are the lucky one. At least you are safe." Elizabeth showed the letter to Greta Hoffmann, and the two women sat together in silence for a long time. Finally, Greta spoke. "She's right, you know. We are the lucky ones. We are fed. We are warm. We are safe. Our people are dying in the ruins of our cities, and we have been saved by the enemy we were taught to hate. What kind of world is this?" It was a question without an easy answer, a question that encapsulated the profound moral and psychological disorientation that many of the prisoners experienced. They were Germans, and they loved their country, their language, their culture, their families. But they were also increasingly aware that their country had been led into catastrophe by a regime that had promised greatness and delivered devastation. They were beneficiaries of their enemies' humanitarian principles, while their own nation was revealed to have abandoned such principles in pursuit of a twisted ideology. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. As spring advanced and the war in Europe entered its final weeks, news reached the camp of events that seemed to arrive from an apocalyptic narrative. Hitler's suicide in his Berlin bunker, the surrender of German forces in Italy, the liberation of additional camps revealing the full scope of the Holocaust, the Red Army's capture of Berlin, and finally, on May 7, 1945, Germany's unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. The Third Reich was finished. Nazi Germany had ceased to exist. The announcement of surrender produced complex reactions among the prisoners: relief that the killing had ended, grief for the destruction of their country, anxiety about what would come next. Some women wept, though whether from sorrow or relief was unclear, perhaps even to themselves. Others sat in stunned silence, processing the enormity of what had happened. The Nazi state, which had claimed it would last a millennium, had collapsed after 12 years, leaving Germany occupied, divided, and devastated. The propaganda claims of inevitable victory had proven to be lies. The promises of Nazi leadership had been revealed as deadly fantasies. Everything they had been taught about German strength and Allied weakness had been inverted. The weak had proven strong. The strong had proven hollow. In the weeks following the surrender, the processing of prisoners accelerated. Women were interrogated more thoroughly now, their wartime roles examined, their connections to war crimes investigated. Most of the women in Camp 27B were determined to have been auxiliary personnel without direct involvement in atrocities, and they were classified as low-level prisoners who would eventually be repatriated to Germany, or what was left of Germany, once appropriate procedures were established. A few were identified as having served in units associated with war crimes and were transferred to other facilities for more intensive investigation. But for the majority, the next phase of their lives would involve returning to a homeland that no longer existed in the form they had known, rebuilding from ruins both physical and moral. Before repatriation began, Colonel Sanders arranged for a final assembly of the prisoners. He stood before them, this middle-aged American officer who had treated them with consistent fairness, and he spoke through an interpreter, though many of the women had learned enough English by now to understand him directly. "You are about to return to Germany," he said. "You will find your country changed, perhaps beyond recognition. You will face hardship and difficulty. You will be tempted to blame others for what has happened. The Allies, the Soviets, traitors within your own ranks. But I urge you to remember your time here. Remember that we treated you according to law and principle, even though your nation was our enemy. Remember that we fed you from our own supplies, that we housed you, that we cared for your sick and injured. We did this not because we are soft or weak, but because we believe that all human beings possess fundamental dignity that must be respected even in war. You were taught that this belief is weakness. You now know it is strength. Take that knowledge with you. Build a new Germany on different principles. Reject the ideology that led your nation to destruction. You have seen an alternative. You have lived it. Remember it." The speech was translated and received in silence. Some women nodded slowly. Others stared at the ground. But Greta Hoffmann, standing in the front row, found herself crying again. Not from shame this time, but from something more complex, a mixture of gratitude, loss, and tentative hope. She had been shown mercy when she expected cruelty. She had been given food when she expected starvation. She had been treated as a human being when she expected to be treated as less than human. These simple acts had accomplished what no propaganda campaign could achieve. They had demonstrated that there was another way to organize society, another set of values to guide human behavior. In the months and years that followed, as the women returned to Germany and began the long process of rebuilding their lives in a divided, occupied nation, many carried with them the memory of their time in American captivity. Not all became Democrats or Americans' admirers. Some retained resentments, blamed the Allies for Germany's destruction, or retreated into nostalgia for a sanitized version of the past. But others became advocates for the new Germany, for democracy, for human rights, for the integration of their nation into the Western community of nations. They raised children whom they taught to question authority, to value humanitarian principles, to remember the costs of totalitarianism. They built careers in the institutions of the Federal Republic, contributing to the creation of a democratic German state that would have been unrecognizable to the Nazi leadership. Greta Hoffmann became a teacher, spending 3 decades educating young Germans about their history, not the heroic mythology of the Nazi era, but the actual history of crimes, failures, and the painful process of confronting collective guilt. In her classroom, she kept a single symbolic object on her desk, a small chocolate bar wrapper from an American Red Cross parcel, preserved carefully between sheets of clear plastic. When students asked about it, she would tell them the story of her time in the POW camp, of the meal she was served by the enemy she had been taught to hate, of the abundance that contradicted propaganda, of the humanitarian principles that proved stronger than ideology. This piece of paper, she would say, represents the difference between tyranny and freedom. Tyranny starves its people while promising greatness. Freedom feeds even its enemies according to principles of law. Never forget that difference. Margaret Schultz, the former radio operator who had worked alongside an African-American soldier in the camp kitchen, returned to Munich and eventually became involved in Christian democratic politics, advocating for racial justice and international reconciliation. She maintained correspondence with Robert, the American soldier who had shown her photographs of his family, for more than 30 years. When she visited the United States in 1978, she traveled to Georgia to meet him and his family. She wrote about the experience. "I stood in Robert's home, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, and I remembered the person I was in 1945, so full of poison ideas, so blinded by ideology, so certain of my superiority. That person died in the American POW camp. She died from an overdose of kindness, from exposure to principles she had never learned, from confrontation with her own ignorance. I do not regret her death. I only regret that she had to die at all, that she was ever created by the poison of Nazi education." The story of Camp 27B and the 73 German women who arrived there on that frozen February morning in 1945 is not widely known. It appears in no major histories of World War II. It merits no commemorative plaques or monuments. And yet it represents something profound about the nature of ideological conflict, about the power of humanitarian principles consistently applied, about the way that simple acts of decency can demolish propaganda more effectively than any weapon. The women expected brutality and received fairness. They expected deprivation and received abundance. They expected to be treated as subhuman and were treated as human beings possessed of inherent dignity. These expectations and their contradictions transformed understanding more powerfully than any re-education program or propaganda campaign could have achieved. The chocolate bars, the coffee, the blankets, the hot showers, the medical care. These were not luxuries provided to prisoners out of excessive generosity. They were the minimum standards required by international law and American military regulations. But to prisoners from a nation that had abandoned such standards in pursuit of ideological purity and racial supremacy, these minimums appeared as abundance. The contrast revealed not that Americans were unusually virtuous, but that the Nazi regime had been unusually depraved, had normalized cruelty to such an extent that basic decency seemed extraordinary. In the broader narrative of World War II, the treatment of German POWs by American forces represents one of the stark dividing lines between the Allied powers and the Axis. While the Soviet Union, understandably embittered by German atrocities on its territory, subjected German prisoners to harsh conditions and extensive use of forced labor, the Western Allies generally adhered to Geneva Convention standards. Millions of German soldiers spent the war's end and immediate post-war years in American, British, and French custody. Most survived. Most were eventually repatriated. Most received adequate food, medical care, and shelter. This was not perfect. There were abuses. There were failures. There were instances of mistreatment. But the systemic policy was humanitarian treatment according to established international law. This policy had multiple motivations. Partly it was pragmatic. Well-treated prisoners were less likely to resist, more likely to cooperate with interrogation, and represented potential future allies. In the emerging Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union, partly it was legal. The United States had signed the Geneva Convention and took its treaty obligations seriously. Partly it was moral. American political culture, rooted in Enlightenment principles about human rights and dignity, provided ideological resources for humanitarian treatment even of enemies, and partly it was simply institutional. The U.S. military had established procedures for handling prisoners, and American soldiers, products of a society that valued rule-following and institutional authority, generally followed those procedures. The effect, however, was to create millions of living witnesses to the difference between democratic and totalitarian systems. The German soldiers and auxiliaries who experienced American captivity and returned to Germany carried with them an understanding that could not be erased by propaganda or revisionism. They knew from direct experience that the Allies had treated them better than their own government would have treated enemy prisoners. They knew that democratic societies, for all their flaws, operated on fundamentally different and more humane principles than totalitarian states. This knowledge informed the reconstruction of West Germany, the embrace of democratic institutions, the integration into Western alliances, and the development of a political culture that, while far from perfect, represented a dramatic break with the Nazi past. The women of Camp 27B were a small part of this larger story, but their experiences encapsulate the essential dynamic. They were products of a totalitarian system, indoctrinated in its ideology, serving its purposes, committed to its victory. They were captured by enemies who had every reason to hate them, whose countries had suffered from German aggression, whose comrades had died fighting German forces. Yet these enemies treated them not with vengeance, but with law, not with cruelty, but with basic decency, not with deprivation, but with adequate provision. This treatment, maintained consistently over months, accomplished what force alone could never achieve. It broke the hold of totalitarian ideology through the simple demonstration of an alternative. Years later, when Germans spoke of the 0 hour, the moment of absolute defeat in 1945 when everything had to be rebuilt from nothing, many identified not the moment of military surrender but earlier moments of personal realization, when they understood that they had been deceived, that they had served evil, that their enemies had been better than they had been taught. For the women who spent spring 1945 in an American POW camp, eating chocolate from Red Cross parcels and sleeping under warm blankets, provided by soldiers they had been told were savages, that moment of realization came through the simple, powerful experience of humanitarian treatment. The symbolic chocolate bar wrapper that Greta Hoffmann preserved and displayed in her classroom for decades carried meaning far beyond its material insignificance. It represented the victory of principle over power, of law over ideology, of humanitarianism over hatred. It demonstrated that abundance could be a weapon more powerful than scarcity, that treating enemies with dignity could transform them more effectively than treating them with cruelty. It proved that the democratic ideal, imperfectly realized, constantly contested, yet persistently influential, possessed a power that totalitarian efficiency could not match. In February 1945, 73 freezing, starving, terrified women arrived at an American POW camp expecting confirmation of every propaganda claim they had been taught. Instead, they received hot food, warm blankets, medical care, and basic respect. In that gap between expectation and experience, in that contradiction between propaganda and reality, the foundation of their ideological certainty cracked and eventually crumbled. They learned that freedom was not weakness. They learned that abundance was not decadence. They learned that humanitarian principles were not sentimentality, but strength. And they carried those lessons with them into the post-war world, becoming, often quietly and without recognition, part of the foundation upon which a new and better Germany would be built from the ruins of the old. The frozen camp, the terrified prisoners, the American soldiers serving scrambled eggs and coffee. These images might seem mundane compared to the dramatic battles and momentous political decisions that typically dominate historical narratives. But it is often in such mundane moments that the true nature of systems and ideologies is revealed. It is in the treatment of prisoners, the distribution of food, the application of rules to those who have no power to resist, that we see what societies truly value. The women who experienced American captivity saw, touched, tasted, and felt what their society valued versus what the enemy society valued. The comparison was devastating to Nazi ideology and, for many, ultimately liberating. They had been defeated in war, but they had discovered in defeat a truth they had never learned in propaganda-fueled victory: that the greatest strength lies not in the ability to inflict suffering, but in the commitment to alleviate it, even for those who have been your enemies.